So Nuno, where shall we start today? It's our very first episode, so probably I will ask you, how are you feeling today?
Well, really good actually. Thanks for asking. But going a little bit deeper, well, I feel great. But asking this question is a very good starting point to any program for self-development, because actually we only live today. We only exist and make decisions in the present. The past is gone, and the future, we can look forward to it, but it's just in the future. So looking deeply and analyzing how you are feeling today, making this question very honestly inside yourself and looking for the answer, and actually just feeling the answer that comes out is much more powerful than it seems at first glance. So usually the participants, when we ask this question, they go for the easy answer. But when you start thinking a little bit about it and you go deeper, it is much, much more important and more meaningful than just feeling good or feeling not so good or feeling really crappy, whatever, but looking for why that happens. And actually, we can look for the question, how is the walking mentorship feeling today?
That's a good one. I think I will take that one. I feel pretty happy, actually, pretty happy. But also looking forward to slow down in the coming weeks and probably have a rest, because these past, let's say, 4 or 5 months have been extremely intensive for us. Since the middle of March, when we felt that we had to revise our priorities, we had to revise our action plan overall as a organization, as a group of people. We've been working extremely hard to reinvent parts of what we are doing, to create new programs, to create new partnerships. My God, I mean, when I look back these last 4 or 5 months, I have doubts actually there.
You mean the last 3-4 years?
The last 3-4 years.
That's what it feels like.
That's what it feels like. But at the same time, I think that it also explains the reason why we are making this podcast. I mean, what for? Because we've been accumulating, and we are actually I would even say the loyal keepers of so many incredible stories that people have shared with us throughout our programs, the outdoor programs, the online programs, the different routes that we make. But probably it makes sense that we don't keep it as much for ourselves, and we have the humbleness, I would say, to share it with others, because we never know, when you drop this little stone on a pond, what will be the ripple effects, and it's not up to us actually to decide that. So we will do it. We plant the seeds, that we like to say, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll just look for what the future brings. But that aspect of just this wealth of knowledge, and it's not especially practical knowledge. It's practical, but it's also emotional, psychological knowledge that we only accumulated because people have been sharing with us, which is amazing, and we are for sure extremely grateful for that. I mean, we have this huge luck of having the opportunity to do what we love, and actually walking with amazing people on amazing routes is really, well, it's not a job actually, it's much, much more than that, but it's amazingly pleasant. It can also be very challenging, obviously, but from those challenges we also bring out the most amazing solutions, the most amazing insights, and many times just and connecting to that ripple effect you were mentioning, many times we look at things that are apparently meaningless. I mean, almost like you do nothing. You just you share a glass of water, or you offer a hand coming up a steeper climb or something, and that makes the whole difference to someone else. And so
Yes.
being just available, being open to share, to receive, and willing to help and give is probably the most relevant aspect of doing the walking mentorship programs. I mean, you need to remember principle number 3. The more you give, the more you take. That is really an interesting perspective to think. And now we are giving through this podcast, and we really hope for the ripple effect. But I mean, if this is just beneficial to one person, that's great. That's already.
I totally agree with you, and that usually leads us to, in this kilometer zero, we have a second step or a second question that usually asks us, who is around me, and here probably I think the question we need to pose to ourselves. So who participates in this walking mentorship program?
So let's start with our first guest. Who is Gale Saint, in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, well, I always like to say it very simply like this. In what I do is, if you walk out your door from your home and you walk to the end of your garden gate, if you have a garden, and you turn left or right when you walk through that gate, you'll take the road. And if you follow that road far enough, it will come to the end of town and it'll go into the country. And if you keep walking, you'll come to a track, and that track will maybe lead into a trail. And if you follow that trail and you follow it far enough into the hills or the mountains or the forest, you'll come to a place where you find peace. And that is Gale Saints. Gale Saints is all about trails, conservation, and peace building.
Gerard van den Berg.
Originally, you are graduated from, I believe, physical education, and you spend so much time on outdoor, and actually you have spent as well time on special education. And by the way, we had some pretty inspiring conversations about learning and how learning could be improved. Do you want to share with us how actually you see combining outdoors and education in kind of a dream school? Because I guess that we do have that in our minds.
Yeah, definitely. So as you know, I think one of my core beliefs is that we are nature. No, there's no separation. We're one. So the intrinsic value of nature is also inside of us, and we can see, in the last decades, how that connection got deteriorated by how we treat nature. And instead of having a relationship of belonging, it's more a relationship of possession. And that has, and well, it had, and it still is having a really strong impact on ourselves, no? Because if we are nature and we are destroying our habitats, and it has a direct effect on ourselves as well. And what we do in our wilderness trails is also let people experience again the intrinsic value of nature. It's just, I mean, a tree is not just wood that you can turn into paper, but it's also our oxygen. At the same time, there's so much beyond also the visible, no? So being in nature and us being energetic beings, it brings us to what I call the super learning state. And a super learning state is where you experience openness, calmness, clearness, peace, but also joy and coherence, no? The feeling of belonging. And if you share that with other people, that feeling of coherence creates a deep connection, no? Also with the people that you're with, and but also with the environment. And what I always found, and that's what we call the magic zone. So we don't have to do that much to learn. No, it's like a little child. If a little child is in super learning state, which well, scientists say is around 6-7 years. No, when the alpha frequencies start to work in the brain. So the young child, they get into super learning state, and we forget that. No, in our daily lives, we get into the higher betas and in the stress, and we're not open anymore to receive. No, and you can see that like a simple example of it listening. No, we like to admit we don't listen anymore, and when you don't listen, you don't receive, and nature is always giving and receiving, because it's always in it's a learning hub, no? Because well, I don't know if you know about the human frequency, which is actually more or less at the 7.83, no, which is somewhere between alpha and theta frequency, and nature is always in the super learning state. So if we flow into the being of nature, we also get in that super learning state, and you don't have to do so much to get there.
Well, that's really inspiring.
You need to be there, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, but even I would even say you can also imagine being there. No, just closing your eyes would also bring you there. No, because now we know the power of envisioning as well. So closing your eyes and travel to the place that brings you to that super learning state is also an option.
It's so interesting you are saying that, because quite often we hear from people that for instance come on walking mentorship programs, and actually many people, they actually never did anything like that before, and after they come back home, imagine after a month, after 3 months, they share with us that they are seated at a desk in the office in a meeting. They suddenly close their eyes and they kind of time travel, and they are in a specific point on that mountain, on that walk near the river, and actually they can hear, they can feel, and it sounds pretty real.
They can live it again, actually, and enjoy exactly that that deep connection to nature and to ourselves, actually, because what you said before, obviously we are not separated from nature, and so it's actually connecting to ourselves. It's the most amazing feeling.
Dan Rubinstein.
It's funny that you mentioned rapids. I would like to ask you something about rapids, because at the walking mentorship we use walking and nature to support the mentoring process in our programs. But we found that you mentioned on your website something like, my office overlooks gorgeous set of rapids in Ottawa's Rideau River. So how much in what ways do you believe these settings, these rapids for instance, they actually work in your life, if there is a connection? Can you share it with us?
Yeah, it's funny. I looked at those rapids for 2 or 3 years, and every spring here in Ottawa, when the snow melts, the river freezes in the winter, then the ice melts, and then all of the snow surrounding the drainage basin melts, and the river goes from a frozen sheet of ice to roaring rapids with high water. So I watched this pattern for a couple of springs. This is beautiful, but it's way too dangerous and scary and big and loud. But after a couple of years, I thought, no, I'm ready to hop on my board and paddle through there, and it was amazing. And it's very I think sort of dynamic, natural features like that. Whenever I'm in ocean waves surfing or on rapids on my board, I'm a little bit scared and intimidated. And that's very humbling, and that provides kind of the perspective and balance, and shows me that I am just this small speck in this big, powerful world, and that although it's in a sense diminutizes you, it's also very empowering, because it gives you perspective to understand who you are, and as one of 7 billion, what your real role and purpose is. And you can find that same I think, perspective in any natural space, whether it's a trail in the woods, a lake, even a bit of green space in a city. I mean, it's watching birds outside your window. It's going on a hike. It's all of those things. So I think having access to and spending time in those natural places is certainly essential for me, and I think obviously for so many people as well.
Well, thank you so much. You definitely persuaded me to start paddleboarding. I will try it for sure. I've been thinking about it for a while, but I'm gonna try it for sure.
Jane Murray.
Jane, let me take you to probably the opposite side of what you just said right now. How can we pay with kindness when our salaries, they continue to be paid in different national currencies?
So the question is, how can we pay in kindness when our salaries are paid in different national currencies? Okay.
If it's possible.
So, well, all things are possible if we're willing to hold the possibility of them, right? You know, I mean, I think that, you know, if we begin with defeatism, right, then nothing's possible. So I think that's the first point that I would make. For us, right, and you know, we're pioneers in kindness capitalism, if you like, you know, where in Peace Beam we're now accepting acts of kindness as well as money, right, as a currency. And how the reason that we are doing that is really to, not because we think it's, you know, some utopian solution to the kind of ills of our, you know, neoliberalist, where we've arrived at with those kind of values in the West, but because we feel that it is vital that we start to experiment with different understandings of what is valuable, and that businesses start to undertake that degree of imaginative thinking and possibility, and the space within which those questions can be held, and they're difficult questions. And then you start to create a field of emergence, right, where something new can arrive out of that. But if none of us are willing to hold any of those questions, then everything just remains as an idea, right, or a nice to have. And so we've chosen kindness capital because we profoundly believe in interconnection. But again, interconnection is just a nice idea or a nice thing to say, unless you're really willing to drill down into, okay, well, what does that mean if you live it? And so what we're saying as a company is that if you are kind to somebody on the other side of the world, right, like that doesn't have a direct benefit to us, but we believe that because of the interconnection and the ripple effect of that, that ultimately we all benefit. And therefore that is its own regenerative currency. That is the foundation for how, as a collective, that we can thrive. So, so that's where we view it, right? We view it as the kind of the first step in the willingness to hold these disruptive ideas. In the same way, right, that all of the kind of major tech companies that have made these, frankly, I mean, you know, there isn't that much money in the world in terms of the valuations that they have. They were willing to hold the possibilities of all of these ideas without there being any profit attached to it. And then obviously there came the Faustian Pact, where, you know, impatient money, investor money, was demanding something back from it, and then they changed trajectory. But, you know, we have great change because we're willing to hold unusual ideas. You know, we can't solve the problems that we have with the same consciousness that created them, as Einstein, you know, pointed out to us. So that's a very long answer, Joao. Sorry about that.
It's incredible food for thought. And hopefully whoever is listening to podcast will review your answer over and over, because that's probably needed.
I absolutely agree with that statement by Einstein and by so many people. Actually, the construction that you just made, which is, if we don't hold things as possible, and if we keep looking at things through the same lens, we will never see a different picture. So that is probably the most amazing human characteristic, is that we are capable of doing that, of stepping out of our perspective and doing something new.
Yeah. I think that's really right, Nina. And I think, you know, the two kind of real imperatives of what it is to be human is the instinct to survive and the instinct to create, and the two go together, you know.
Yeah.
And I think at the moment we're locked into this kind of bleak survivalism from a psychological point of view, emotionally, mentally, and physically. And I think that what we need now to break out of that is to rebalance it with our profound creativity and on our ability to imagine a different way of being.
Alex, Sonjung Kimpang.
You know, walking is probably one of the most, if not the most inefficient way to get from point A to point B. I heard that at least once in one of our programs. You know, a participant brought my attention to that point. Nevertheless, we also understand that by walking, you can have a level of engagement related with your life, your thoughts, that probably you can hardly reach the same level in other activities. Do you see any kind of parallelism between, you know, this conflict between efficiency and engagement in the workplace? Because it seems that some organizations, they see it on part of the same equation, but you know, how this is happening, how can you be efficient, but at the same time be engaged at doing something, or it's either or? How do you see it?
Well, I think that, you know, that much of the problem comes from defining efficiency along sort of using the wrong axes or sort of wrong metrics. So when we think of, you know, sort of efficient use of people's time as sort of maximizing the number of hours that they're working for us, for example, I think that's that turns out to be a kind of category error that not only fails to recognize the that sort of hours spent at a task do not translate into sort of higher productivity, and indeed after a certain period productivity drops after long periods of overwork, but it also incentivizes at the managerial and organizational level all kinds of bad behavior, right? I think that the, you know, companies and managers have the freedom not to make hard choices about priorities if, for example, you know, if you can just assume that everyone will stay late and just do everything. And so, you know, so that's an example of a kind of organizational inefficiency, a kind of inefficiency in the attention of, you know, of a firm that is enabled by sort of by a vision of how people of how organizations can use people's time most efficiently, quote unquote. And so I do, you know, so I do think that it is necessary to sort of rethink what efficiency and effectiveness and productivity really mean, and how we measure, and sort of what indicators we use sort of to measure and to understand them. But once we do, we can construct workplaces and routines and lives that are sort of both more productive and, you know, and sort of more pleasurable, and also, you know, leave in a lot more time for apparently inefficient but secretly sort of very productive things like, you know, like walking.
That's a great answer.
Jessica Warkin.
I would like to ask you, Jessica, why do you think deep listening is important, and how can we get better at deep listening?
So from early age, many of us have been trained and taught how to talk. So much that goes into the art of speaking, the art of presentation, the art of debate, the art of making your argument, of making your case. And specifically as a woman, actually as a girl, and I was trained in order to fight with the guys, to be verbally very proficient and be able to get your argument and back it with facts and get it out there. But everything was about putting out. It was, I think of it as like the great exhale. What we often are not trained to do or taught to do is what I like to think of as like the great inhale. How do you actually slow yourself down, quiet the mind, and truly take in the information that's all around you? Now, that could be what somebody else is saying. That could be reading your environment. That could be picking up on the energy of a room. But it's a very, very different way of moving through the world. It's a slowing down and an opening up and a being receptive to what's there. And when that happens, I think it's also very connected to your question about creativity. It's the ability to, the great inhale then creates, there's more information coming in, there's more field of play from which you can then make decisions, from which you can then be creative, from which you can then formulate a point of view and move forward.
Well, I think we cannot resist to ask you if there is like a particular situation in which deep listening made a difference to you. Maybe you want to share a little secret with us.
Sure, actually. While working with the Obama Foundation, which was a pretty extraordinary experience to be able to work with the foundation and to be able to work with the former president, we were in a pretty heated discussion where it was the executive team of the foundation, and it was an argument in many ways about strategy and different opinions between the senior leadership about directionally where to focus. And I and my colleagues, we were kind of all in it, and we were sort of having this debate. And I realized I actually took a moment and stopped talking and really quieted myself down and just sat and really listened to what was happening in the room. And what came out for me was that there was one person among this really animated, heated debate, there was one person who was not sharing their opinion. And I stopped the debate and I asked permission for this person to come and say what had not been said. And they did. And it was a turning point for the conversation and for an understanding of where they were going to head strategically. But I think I would have missed that, because if I had just been kind of a combatant in the fray, trying to make the point about strategy and where to go, I would have missed that there was a voice that was missing. And there was such deep wisdom in what this person had to say that then changed the outcome of the conversation. So it's listening both for what is said, but it's also listening for what's not being said. And it's also listening for whose voices are not in the room, whose perspectives are not present. And then I feel it's my role, both as leader of my company and also working with clients and groups, is actually to create the space for those voices to come forward.
Shane O'Mara.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about our stress and anxiety and how much that can influence our brain system. And actually, I would like to ask you what can or what we should do to improve this situation, especially, I would say again, when you spend so many hours in front of a screen, computer or a phone.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it brings in a lot of kind of themes. So the first thing to say is that humans evolved in an open landscape. We didn't evolve in a built environment, and we now live a life that keeps us indoors for perhaps 90-95% of our waking time, which is completely different to the kind of conditions that we actually evolved in. You know, the built environment as we have it is a feature of perhaps the last 1,000 years, or maybe a little bit longer, maybe 2,000 years or whatever. But for most of our existence, this is not the environment that we lived in. So what we know is that when humans are brought out into nature, they feel a sense of restorativeness from nature when they have the experience of green, and that this reduces the levels of stress hormones and does so, it seems, to a reasonable degree, to the point that people report quite a high degree of feeling of well-being as a result of being exposed to nature. And I always think it's kind of curious, I suppose, that one of the most prestigious forms of sport in terms of cost and all of the other things is golf, where people walk tremendous distances in these beautifully tended green fairways. So it kind of brings back almost the verdant plains that we might have experienced in Africa all of those thousands of years ago. So regular exposure to nature is something that we need to do more of. And what we see repeatedly is this message coming from neuroscience and coming from psychiatry, coming from psychology, that we need to green our cities and towns because this has a marked effect on the stress levels that people experience. And there's a reason why our leafy suburbs, as they're sometimes laughed at or described as, are more expensive. People are willing to pay in order to have a view of nature. This is why, take the kind of Sentinel or Signal example, Central Park in New York. If you have an apartment overlooking Central Park, that will cost millions more than an apartment that overlooks some other part of New York City. Having a view of green is something that has marked health benefits. It reduces stress levels and is something that we should be designing into our towns and cities, but it's frequently overlooked.
Jennifer Walsh.
So let me ask you here a tricky question. We know you've had some interaction with neuroscientists, and for sure you've learned some interesting things. Would you share some of that knowledge with us?
Absolutely. I think the more we find out, the more intrigued we are at how our brain actually changes when we are in nature. And when I learned about awe and the profound experience of just having an awe experience, and you see a rainbow or a waterfall or having a bird land on your hand, it's just these like little moments in time that really almost rewire our brains to help us get out of the everyday. So it's fascinating when you really kind of see what happens to our brains. But also I'm going to go back to something else too, which I found out from a scientist. There are phytoncides that are released from certain trees, mostly conifer trees around the world. And there's Dr. Lee discovered this in the early 1980s, that these trees bathe themselves in these phytoncides or aerosols. And they bathe themselves to kind of protect themselves from bacteria and illness. So when we then inhale those phytoncides when we're walking around the trees, it activates something within us called NK cells, or NK cells get activated, natural killer cells. And when they get activated, it helps us ward off our own disease and illness. So these phytoncides are basically like a daily multivitamin. And Dr. Lee discovered this in the 1980s, and he's been doing so many tests over the decades. And it's beautiful to kind of watch like how simple it is, just how lucky we are just to walk around conifer trees, pine trees, and inhale phytoncides, and it actually acts like a multivitamin. So there's all these great things happening to our bodies and our brains if we just allow ourselves the time to be in it.
Wow, it's wonderful. I mean, and I really hope that the more people hear about this incredible, available, good medicine,
yes.
make a better use of it. It's
absolutely
and for free.
Yes, that's the best part. And that's why they have these sort of great park RX things happening around the world. And I know some doctors are now prescribing nature, especially in Europe. I see it a lot more in Europe than the US. US is slow to coming on to that concept, but Europe, they've been doing it for years. So it's great to see they're prescribing nature. Take a little nature walk and call me in the morning.
It's wonderful because it's really kind of a gateway for an adventure with your life. So,
Miriam Lopez.
But before we finish, we still have one really unfair challenge for you. I'm sorry, but this is something we do. If you had a time capsule, almost like a message in a bottle that you could send today, throw it out into space or whatever, with a message or some objects or whatever you want to put inside. And then someday, maybe tomorrow or maybe in a million years, someone or some entity will find it. What would you put inside that time capsule? I know it's unfair.
I don't know, but maybe a little mirror, I think. And yeah, I think a little mirror, just a little one. No words, nothing. Just that's where all the answers are. We don't need to look outside or. Yeah, that's the thing.
That's a good reflection.
That's a good reflection. It's weird, but it comes from me. So.
Wow.
David Clutterbuck.
Well, you talk very often about positive change. What exactly do you mean by that?
For me, positive change is a change that helps somebody, an individual, to become more in tune with their environment, or for a company or a society, but it's something about being aligned and in tune with the world around us. Hence, that's why doing coaching while walking is a great way of achieving that, because we've got a constant reminder of it. I like to depict coaching and mentoring, from which coaching derives in large part, in the terms that Joseph Campbell, the researcher who looked at the great sagas, the heroic sagas, where mentors appear frequently. And the critical thing there is that the mentor does not walk in front of you, or the coach does not walk in front of you. They walk beside you. And that being beside somebody on their journey is the core metaphor, I think. We're not there to walk behind them or in front of them, we're there beside them. And that's when you're beside somebody, that's when you can have the deepest conversations. It's really hard to have a really strong, meaningful conversation with somebody who's in front or behind.
Well, really thank you for your answer, because I think 2 or 3 years ago, in the end of one of our walking mentorship programs, one of the participants in the last meal shared something that I connect with what you just said, because we keep repeating, keep walking with us, or keep walking with me, depending on the situation. And this person said, oh, I finally understand what you're saying, because the implications of such sentence, they are bidirectional. So it's not really about you or me, it's about us, and it's about walking together side by side. So thank you for clarifying that. But
let me add,
yeah,
can I add something to that? Yeah. Over the last 30 years, we've done experiments with thousands of people, where we've got them to talk about what we call personal reflective space. And that's about the way that you go into yourself and how you think about an issue deeply. And the relationship between the depth of your thinking about an issue and the speed with which you walk or run or whatever, there's a clear correlation. So essentially, as you start to think more deeply about something, you slow down, because your blood is taking more of the sugar that would go to your muscles and using it in your brain. And as you reach that point of insight, and then you understand things more clearly, you may very often have actually stopped. But then as you come out of this, the brain no longer needs to work so hard. And then you find you pick up your pace again. And time again in my own ramblings, that's what happens. You see it at work, you get to that point of insight, and you by that time just slow down. It's almost like taking your foot off the pedal when you're driving the car, and not being aware that the car is slowing down.
Absolutely. Totally. No, yes, absolutely. But before we leave, there are two things that really got stuck on my mind throughout our conversation. The first one is really the pleasure of being on a conversation with a truly free mind. I mean, the world is so full of narratives these days, and you might agree more or less, but they are out there, and many times they are pushed into our lives even without noticing. And what I take out of this conversation with you, and not by chance being the last episode of all this series of truly beautiful people. I think it's really the cherry on top of the cake to have another free mind tell us that when you question, when you open up to question, usually you gain a lot, and that's the first thing. The second, I have to tell you that I have doubts, and I was thinking, should I ask or not? But now I think I already know the answer. I was thinking, how old are you, David? Because I thought, are you 40 already? Did you cross that threshold? Because the feeling I have is that I am talking with someone much younger than me, than myself, and this is it's truly inspiring and a blessing. So personally, I feel very honored, very humbled that you are walking with us on this last stretch of a full year of podcasts. Keep walking with me.
Well, I have to say, of course, as you know, I'm 73, going on 16, and I'm absolutely enjoying it. And you know, the first part of what you were saying, we do talk about, you know, the narrative, and I think, you know, if you mispronounce it, narrative becomes narrative, and too much of what we hear is narratives. It's blinkered. And I think we should be trying to create for ourselves and for those around us and the wider environment. Let's have widatives instead of narratives. That's the way to be aware of everything that's around us. If we just focus internally, we miss all that stuff that's surrounding us. That's so wonderful.
That's a great advice. I think we should all follow it. And starting by ourselves and hopefully spreading the word. So, well, actually it's humbling to talk to you, especially because of your own humility. You make it all so simple. So it's lovely. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Our pleasure.
Step by step, we walk together towards the best version of ourselves. For more information about our mentoring programs, visit our website walkingmentorship.com. Keep Walking with Me, it is a podcast inspired by the Walking Mentorship experience.